Emperor Nero and his perverse love, the tragedy of Sporus. The name of one of the darkest periods in the history of the Roman Empire is linked to Nero and Sporus. When Emperor Nero ascended to the throne of Rome at a young age, he was not just a ruler, but a figure known for his passion for art and the stage. Yet his story is remembered not for his love of music and theatre, but for his depraved desires and inhumane acts. The name Nero became a symbol of power, passion, and madness. One of the tragedies in his life was shaped by an event that completely altered the fate of a young man. The story of Sporus. Sporus was a young boy who was castrated to replace Nero's deceased wife, a living testament to Nero's perverse passions. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, Nero grew up in this very environment. His mother, Agrippina, was one of the ambitious and daring women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. From his childhood, she began paving the way with intrigues and alliances to ensure her son would one day become emperor. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a harsh but relatively insignificant senator. With his death, Agrippina focused all her attention on her son. In Rome, the shadow of the throne was not just a symbol of a golden crown, but also of death. To be an emperor meant, on one hand, to be seen as divine and close to the gods in the eyes of the people, and on the other, to be eliminated in the shadow of daggers at the slightest wrong move. Agrippina knew this well and charted a sharp path for her son's survival. The most crucial step that changed Nero's destiny was his mother's marriage to Emperor Claudius. Claudius was a surprisingly ordinary and elderly member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but the throne was in his hands. Agrippina's true purpose with this marriage was to make Nero, not Claudius's own son, the heir to the throne. To this end, intrigues, rumours of poison, and palace conspiracies followed one after another. Finally, Claudius's sudden death cleared the way for Nero. Rome heard the footsteps of a young emperor who was just 17 years old. Initially, Nero managed to win the affection of the people. His gentle demeanour, interest in the arts, and youth made him popular. The Roman populace was hopeful for a young emperor's rule after a series of harsh and elderly rulers. But those who knew the dark side of the palace saw the shadow of his mother over him. Agrippina was not content with merely placing her son on the throne. She wanted to be influential in the government as well. It was at this point that the young Nero's character began to be shaped. On one hand, he was a youth who wanted to be free and immerse himself in art and pleasure. On the other, he was a figure carrying the heavy burden of the empire under his mother's pressure. This contradiction formed the basis of the psychological conflict that would underlie many of his future actions. Although the expanding borders of Rome presented an image of stability in Nero's early years, the empire was actually in turmoil from within. The tension between the Senate and the emperor, the army's pressure on the palace, and the populace's demand for bread and circuses all depended on a fragile balance. Nero, placed at the centre of this balance at a young age, was not a person with the character to bear this weight. Here, the irony of history begins. Although Nero, in the first years of his reign, displayed a reasonable administration under the guidance of talented advisers and his mother, the storms within him would soon drag Rome into bloodshed, scandals, and unprecedented perversions. The ambition instilled in him during childhood, the ruthlessness he inherited from his mother, and the intoxication of power would soon write one of the darkest pages in Roman history. Nero, Octavia, and Poppaea, a palace full of intrigue. When Nero ascended the throne, he was only 17. Taking on the responsibility of an empire at such an age was a heavy burden in itself, but the real issue was that the people around him tried to use this young ruler for their own purposes. the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, advisors, and most importantly, his mother, Agrippina, all tried to control Nero from different angles. In this environment, one of the most critical steps was the issue of marriage. The person Nero married was Octavia, the daughter of Claudius. This marriage was a politically flawless move. The two branches of the Julio-Claudian dynasty were united, strengthening Nero's legitimacy. The Roman people also loved Octavia, seeing her as a chaste, humble, and noble woman. However, this marriage would soon turn into a tragedy in the palace's atmosphere, which was full of ambition and passion. Octavia was not the type of wife Nero wanted. She was a silent, composed woman, politically suitable but devoid of passion. Nero, on the other hand, with the fire of his youth, was pursuing a completely different life. Art, theatre, luxury, entertainment, and most importantly, passionate affairs. Octavia's sobriety had become a boring chain for him. Initially, he had to maintain this marriage because both his mother, Agrippina, and the Roman people supported this union. However, as time passed, Nero's patience ran out. At this point, Poppaea Sabina appeared on the scene. Poppaea was a woman known in Rome for her beauty and intelligence. She had been married before, never hid her ambitions, and always desired more. When she caught Nero's attention, she became not just a mistress, but also a danger. This was because Poppaea wanted not only Nero's love, but also to become empress. Octavia, in the midst of all these events, became a shadow. She was losing her husband's interest and becoming the target of palace intrigues. Under Poppaea's influence, Nero began to act colder and harsher toward Octavia. This situation became not just a personal matter, but a political crisis. As the people who supported Octavia saw the injustice done to her, they began to grumble against Nero. Agrippina also played an important role in this marriage issue. Initially, she had supported Octavia and tried to prevent her son from turning to Poppaea. However, this situation increased the tension between mother and son. Nero was caught between his passion for Poppaea and the pressure from his mother. Eventually, this conflict would end in death. Nero feared and hated his mother's power and ultimately ordered her to be eliminated. Octavia's fate was equally brutal. When Nero finally wanted to make Poppaea empress, he divorced Octavia. But this was not just a divorce. False accusations of adultery were made against her, and various schemes were devised to ruin her reputation. A large portion of the public was outraged by this, and demonstrations were organized in the streets for Octavia. Still, Nero did not back down. Octavia was exiled and then executed. Octavia's death was a great shock to the Roman people. The brutal murder of a chaste, innocent, and beloved empress further solidified Nero's image as a tyrant. But for Nero, this was merely the removal of an obstacle. Poppaea Sabina had now ascended to the throne as empress. However, behind this victory lay tragedies that were etched into Roman history as a dark stain. Poppaea's tragic reign and the search for a new love. Poppaea Sabina is one of the most controversial female figures in Roman history. Her story is written not only by her beauty, but also by her ambitions and strategic intelligence. When she entered Nero's life, she never aimed to be a mere lover. She wanted the emperor's heart and the palace throne. This ambition carried her to the peak and also led to a tragic end. After Octavia's death, Poppaea became Nero's official wife. She was now the new empress of Rome. However, this title also came with great risk. The public was still mourning Octavia, holding Poppaea responsible for her death. Whispers circulated in the palace corridors saying, Rome would have been more peaceful if Octavia had lived. But Poppaea was not intimidated by these glances. On the contrary, she tried to become even more powerful. One of Poppaea's most notable traits was her influence over Nero. She knew the emperor's weaknesses, fueled his passions, and skillfully directed his anger. Historians say that Poppaea used Nero like a puppet. Nero's passion for art, his desire to perform on stage, his fascination with theatre, all of these were supported, even encouraged by Poppaea. This was because she could keep the emperor under her control by nurturing his weaknesses. However, the most striking aspect of this relationship was that it was steeped in violence. In Nero's personality, passion and rage were often mixed. The Nero who loved Poppaea passionately was also a man who shook her with fits of jealousy and hurt her with outbursts of anger. The line between love and hate in their relationship was constantly blurred. The most dramatic event occurred at Poppaea's death. According to legend, Poppaea was pregnant. In one of his angry outbursts, Nero kicked her in the abdomen, killing her. This scene went down in Roman history as the bloodiest moment of passion. Of course, some historians question this story. Perhaps Poppaea died of natural causes, or perhaps the event was different. But what remained in the public memory was that the emperor was savage enough to kill his own wife. After Poppaea's death, Nero went into a deep state of mourning. He had her buried in a magnificent ceremony, and he cried at the funeral. This hypocritical grief made Nero even more two-faced in the eyes of the Roman people, as everyone knew that the emperor himself was the one most responsible for Poppaea's death. After Poppaea, the palace corridors did not fall silent. On the contrary, her absence created a new void. Nero began to seek the passion he had lost elsewhere. This search would lead to one of the strangest and most perverse relationships in history. It was here that a young boy named Sporus would appear on the stage. His story carried both the shadow of Poppaea and Nero's insane passion. Even after her death, Poppaea Sabina haunted Rome like a ghost. A memory shaped Nero's subsequent behavior. The emperor wanted to find someone to fill Poppaea's place, but the person he found was not a woman. This would give birth to one of history's most unusual pairings. The bizarre obsession, the castration of Sporus. After Poppaea Sabina's death, Nero's soul fell into a deep void. The emperor had lost the wife to whom he was passionately devoted. But this loss was not merely emotional grief. It turned into an obsession within the emperor's being. He could not let go of Poppaea's image and was looking for someone who could take her place. But what he was looking for was not a new woman, but a reflection of Poppaea. It was at this point that a young boy named Sporus appeared on the stage of history. Sources write that Sporus had an extraordinary beauty. With his delicate features, slender physique, and soft gaze, he possessed a feminine grace. When Nero saw him, the first thing that came to his mind was his deceased wife, Poppaea. It was as if fate had brought the late empress back in a young body. A dangerous idea formed in Nero's mind. If Sporus were a woman, a dangerous idea formed in Nero's mind. If Sporus were a woman, he could fill Poppaea's place. This thought quickly turned into an obsession. The emperor commanded his men to castrate Sporus. Thus the young boy became a victim of a forced transformation. He was now stripped of his masculinity, his body mutilated for the sake of the emperor's desires. The castration was shocking not only for Sporus, but also for Roman society. Roman culture viewed masculinity as a great virtue. Valor, strength, and power were all tied to masculinity. However, the emperor had defied this most sacred value and shaped a young man's body according to his own perversions. This was an act that turned Roman values upside down. Sporus's tragedy did not end there. After being castrated, Nero began to treat him as a replacement for Poppaea. The clothes he was made to wear, the jewels he wore, and even his hairstyle were arranged to mimic Poppaea. Sporus was no longer just a young boy, but had been transformed into the shadow of the deceased empress. Historians record this event as one of Rome's most perverse moments. It was not merely about lust, but also a murder of identity. Sporus's personality, gender, and freedom were annihilated for the sake of the emperor's desires. Nero did not hesitate to formalize this obsession with Sporus. He arranged a magnificent wedding ceremony. Sporus wore a bridal dress and a crown and was presented to the Roman people just like an empress. The emperor declared that he had married him. This wedding caused both astonishment and outrage in Rome. The people were revolting against their emperor's extreme public display, but fear suppressed the rebellion. Sporus's new life was a golden cage. He was seemingly the emperor's wife, but in reality he was a slave who had lost his identity, freedom, and masculinity. His life was nothing more than a reflection of Nero's passions, and this reflection was being displayed on Rome's greatest imperial stage. Sporus's story was not just a personal tragedy, it was also a symbol of an empire's decline. The empire, symbolized by the might of Rome, had now become a plaything of individual desires. The final curtain, the end of Nero and Sporus. The wedding of Nero and Sporus was an unthinkable scandal for the Roman people. The emperor had castrated a young man, dressed him in a bridal gown, and then declared him his wife. This event did not stay confined within the palace walls. It became a topic of discussion in the streets of Rome, in its forums, and even in the legion's barracks. After the ceremony, Sporus's life changed dramatically. He was now seen as the empress and appeared alongside the emperor at public ceremonies. The jewels he wore, the crowns on his head, and the silk clothes he was made to wear all reflected Poppaea's style. Nero was trying to resurrect his lost wife in the light. Within the palace, Sporus's presence evoked a sense of curiosity mixed with fear. Some senators and nobles openly regarded the emperor's behavior as perversion, while others chose to remain silent. Falling victim to Nero's wrath could mean a death sentence. At that time, the slightest opposition could result in exile or execution. Thus, most people attended the wedding with forced smiles, offered gifts, and were forced to be seen beside their emperor. Among the populace, the marriage became a subject of mockery. Whispers circulated on the streets of Rome. People laughed, saying, "Our emperor is in love not with a woman, but with a young man." But these laughs were kept secret as Nero's spies were everywhere. Even a single rumor could land a citizen in prison. Nero, though aware of these reactions, paid no mind. What mattered to him was to satisfy his own desires. The values of Rome, the expectations of the people, or the traditions of the empire meant nothing against his passions. The emperor had turned Rome into his personal theatre. Sporus had taken on the most important role in this theatre, to be the ghost of the deceased empress. Sporus's life was outwardly magnificent, but in reality, it was a deep tragedy. Once a free young man, he was now a shadow who had lost his identity. His body was adorned with gold, but his soul was chained. When he walked through the marble corridors of the palace, everyone bowed to him with respect, but this respect was fake. He had become an object of pity and morbid curiosity. Over time, Sporus became one of Rome's most famous figures. The nicknames given to him became subjects of songs and jokes. On one hand, he was the emperor's beloved. On the other, he was Rome's fool. This duality made his life unbearable, as he was forced to bear an identity imposed on him against his will. Sporus's story exposed the corruption at the peak of Roman power. The empire was no longer remembered for its magnificent victories, but for being the stage of personal passions. The people were too afraid to revolt, but the anger seething within them was growing. Sporus's existence had become a symbol of this anger. He represented not the greatness of Rome, but its decay. The end of an era. The final years of Nero's reign were filled with chaos and fear. The great fire of Rome, the persecution of Christians, and the army's discontent shook the emperor's power. The emptying of the treasury, the loss of Senate support, and the public's rage converged, leaving Nero isolated. In 68 AD, rebellion swept through Rome. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. This decision was the beginning of the end for the... In those moments, Sporus was still by his side. According to some accounts, Nero turned to him and said, "I wish to die with you." But he lacked the courage to take his own life. With the help of his slave, Epaphroditus, he finally plunged a dagger into his throat. He died uttering the words, "What a great artist dies with me." Nero's death did not end Sporus's tragedy. He was first forcibly taken into the household of Otho, then of Vitellius. Vitellius wanted to make a mockery of Sporus in front of the Roman people. He planned to present him in the arena like a mythological sacrifice. Upon learning this, Sporus chose to end his own life rather than be humiliated again. It is said that he committed suicide with the help of his close servants. Thus, Rome's most perverse love story ended with two tragic deaths. Sporus's name was etched into Roman history as an indelible stain. He was the victim of an emperor's obsession. His story represented the dark side behind Rome's glorious ambitions.